Most people think shipping is about movement. Container ships crossing oceans, ports unloading steel boxes through the night, cargo flowing endlessly between continents. From a distance, the entire system feels alive. Always moving, always accelerating. But if you zoom out, something strange appears. The people making the largest fortunes in global shipping are often the furthest away from the cargo itself. They do not manage containers, they do not negotiate delivery schedules, they rarely deal with customers. In many cases, they never touch the flow at all. Because in global trade, the real power is not in moving goods, it is in owning the infrastructure that movement depends on. And those are two very different businesses. What we call the shipping industry is actually two separate systems stacked on top of each other. On the surface, you have operators, the companies people recognize. Maersk, MSC, CMACGM. They schedule routes, manage ports, move containers across the planet. But underneath them is another layer entirely. The owners, the people controlling the ships themselves. One side manages motion, the other controls the steel. And once those two roles separate, the economics of shipping begin to change completely. A cargo ship looks like transportation. But financially, it behaves more like movable infrastructure. Closer to a floating toll road than a truck, a highway generates value because traffic needs somewhere to go. A ship works the same way. Its value comes from existing where global trade needs capacity. And unlike infrastructure on land, a ship can relocate. If trade slows in Europe, the vessel leaves. If demand surges in Asia, it moves there instead. The steel follows the pressure of the system, almost like liquid. That mobility changes everything. A shopping mall trapped in a declining city becomes a dead asset. But a ship can cross an ocean and attach itself to an entirely different economy. Demand does not disappear, it shifts, and the asset shifts with it. Most ship owners never operate their vessels, they lease them. Under what is called a time charter, the operator controls the voyage. They pay for fuel, crew, port charges, routing, cargo logistics. The owner does something much simpler. They provide the steel and charge for access to it. A mid-sized container ship can generate tens of thousands of dollars per day simply for being available. Not because cargo arrived faster, not because the route was efficient, but because global trade needed space. And the owner controlled part of that space. The ship becomes less like transportation and more like rented capacity floating through the global economy. At first, this arrangement seems inefficient. Why would shipping companies avoid owning the ships they depend on? Because shipping is violently unstable, ports clog, fuel prices spike, trade routes collapse. Wars redraw logistics maps overnight, and when disruptions happen, they spread through the system extremely fast. In 2021, the Ever Given became stuck inside the Suez Canal. One ship, one narrow passage. And suddenly nearly 12% of global trade stopped moving. Hundreds of vessels began stacking up behind it, like blood clotting inside an artery. For operators, it was chaos. Schedules collapsed. Cargo missed deadlines. Containers arrived weeks late. But for ship owners, the event revealed something deeper. Global trade depends on constant circulation. Yet the system has almost no tolerance for interruption, and owning ships directly means absorbing that fragility yourself. Leasing changes the equation. Operators stay flexible. The long-term structural risk moves somewhere else, but the risk never disappears, it simply moves. Operators absorb short-term pressure, owners absorb long-term exposure, and the ship sits between them like a steel bridge carrying uncertainty back and forth across the ocean. That is why shipping wealth is built differently from most industries. It is not about eliminating instability, it is about surviving it longer than everyone else. Shipping moves in violent cycles. When trade expands, freight rates surge. When demand weakens, they collapse, sometimes faster than the ships themselves can change direction. In 2008, global trade contracted sharply, and suddenly entire fleets became too expensive to operate. Ships that looked profitable months earlier turned into floating debt. Ports slowed, routes disappeared. Steel lost value almost overnight, because in shipping, the asset is only valuable if the system around it keeps moving. Most ships are heavily financed, roughly 30% equity, 70% debt, which means many vessels are effectively floating on borrowed money. That structure magnifies returns during booms, but during downturns, it becomes dangerous, because even when cargo disappears, the debt remains perfectly still, waiting. And once the value of the ship falls below the value of the loan, ownership can evaporate very quickly. Entire fleets have disappeared this way, not from storms, from mathematics. Then comes liability. A single accident at sea, an oil spill, a collision, a grounding, can trigger billions of dollars in claims. So ship ownership evolved defensive architecture. Most vessels are isolated inside separate legal entities. One ship, one company. If that vessel fails, the damage stays trapped inside its own container. The rest of the fleet survives. The risk is compartmentalized, almost like a submarine sealing flooded sections before the entire structure sinks. Loss is not prevented, it is contained. Ships also decay in another way, not physically first, economically. Fuel regulations tighten, engine technology improves, environmental standards shift, and suddenly a ship built 10 years ago can become commercially obsolete. Not because it stopped floating, but because the system moved on without it. In shipping, assets rarely die slowly. They fall behind suddenly. So when we look at global trade, we usually focus on movement, the containers, the ports, the ships crossing oceans. But underneath all that motion is another system entirely. A system managing exposure, timing, debt, fragility, and risk. The people controlling shipping often are not the ones moving cargo. They are the ones controlling the capacity that movement depends on. Because in systems like this, power does not come from touching the flow, it comes from owning the bottlenecks underneath it, and everything else adjusts around them.